Hey folks, Matt Easton here. So I'm not getting much time to film at home at the moment, so I thought, what the hell, I'll kill two birds with one stone and do some filming in front of my club. So you may struggle to hear me, but that's your tough luck, I guess. Obviously you can see some of my club sparring behind me at the moment. We have something interesting here, and it's a Gladius. Now, I know that my friends Raffaello, for example, on Metatron channel have spoken lots about Gladii. Gladioli? No, Gladii. And I think even Lloyd Lindy Beige has spoken about Gladiuses, Gladii. So I'm not going to go, this is going to be an in-depth video at all, but I thought, as I've got one here, this is my friend Gavin. Where's Gavin? He's over there fighting somewhere, I think. It's his new acquisition, and so I thought I'd talk a little bit about it. This is the Albion, I think it's the Augustus, but it's one of the Albion Gladiuses. It's, as you can see, it's a Mainz pattern Gladius. The Mainz pattern is slightly wasted, not wasted as in drunk, but wasted as in it gets a bit slimmer here, and then broader in the cutting portion here, and then goes to a very pointy point. Now, one thing that's often said about the Gladius is that it's a thrusting sword. Well, it's also really broad and very clearly very good at cutting. Anybody who holds one of these things will instantly think, yeah, I can chop really, really well with this. Now, I think it's important to point out that when Roman sources talk, particularly Vegetius, for example, talks about thrusting with the sword, you've got to put that into context in that it is therefore also a cutting sword. Okay, no author would bother to specify that you should thrust with your Gladius if you couldn't also cut with it. Okay, no one ever said in a small sword treatise, oh, make sure you thrust a lot with your small sword, because they didn't need to say that. You pick up a small sword, it's obvious it's for thrusting. With a Gladius, that's not the case. It's a cut and thrust sword. And you know, there are archaeological remains of people who've been wounded and chopped up with Roman swords and show lots of cut injuries. It's very clear to see that this is a sword, just checking there's no one behind me, this is a sword that absolutely, definitely can cut really effectively. Now, the other thing to say about the Gladius connected to this is it's also a sword that's absolutely intended to be used with a massive shield, with a Scutum. Now, that's not to say that these were never used by themselves. Occasionally, yes, a Gladius, you might be just wearing a Gladius like this. You might be wearing a Gladius and you might not have your shield to hand, you might not have your shield with you. You might be carrying a standard, you might be riding a horse as a messenger. You could be doing any number of things that mean that you don't have a shield. So absolutely, sometimes you would have to draw and use your Gladius in whichever way you could to defend yourself and fight without a shield. But it's definitely primarily a sword designed to be used with a massive shield. And not just any shield. It's specifically designed to be used with the Scutum. The Scutum being a very long and curved shield which is boss grip. And when you're using a shield with a sword, it really changes the way that you can use the sword. And equally, you have to think about who are you fighting against. If you're predominantly fighting against opponents who are also using large shields, then that dictates how you use your weapon. Now, it just so happens that some years ago now, a couple of years ago, I worked on a BBC production where we were using simulated Gladiuses and Scutums. And after several weeks of training people with these weapons, I discovered that, for me anyway, I won't say this is a new discovery, but for me it was a new discovery, that really the most practical way to use this type of sword with a large shield and against someone with a large shield was to thrust. So, despite the fact that this is very clearly a cut and thrust sword, it just so happens that when you're fighting against opponents with a large shield who have a large shield, it is the point, it is the thrust, which is the most predominant attack and which is the most important. And interestingly, the chopping cut, like swinging like we might do if we were fighting without a shield, like this, was relatively unimportant when you were using a scutum and when the opponent was using a scutum, because essentially if you've got a large shield in front of you, you don't have the space most of the time to swing convincingly, and there's nothing to swing at because your opponent has a large shield in front of them. However, there is a time when cuts do come into play. If you think about two boxers, okay, if those boxers come into a grapple, come in really close, that's a situation where yes, absolutely the point can come around the shield, but sometimes your point doesn't find its target and you overshoot that point. And what we found is that actually a lot of cuts that started happening were with the back edge in a raking fashion. Now this is very interesting in a gladiatorial context because it works in favour of the sika or the sickle sword. It shows perhaps why the sickle sword was popular in the gladiatorial games, and potentially this drawing, hooking cut was employed also with the gladius, and it would make a lot of sense to me. It also makes sense going down for the hamstrings at the legs, but most importantly behind the neck, behind the helmet. And again, you look at a Roman helmet, the helmet that comes over the top here, it has a brim essentially at the front but also sticking out at the back, and it could be that that brim is there to protect from, if you've got a large scutum and you're coming in close, what often happens is your weapon, instead of coming in front of the person, comes over behind the person and starts raking behind their neck and behind their head, either with the point or the back inside edge. And it does seem like Roman helmets were potentially designed with that in mind. So, to cut to the chase, I do absolutely think that the gladius is a cut and thrust sword, but don't only think about that in terms of cutting like we might cut with a sabre or an arming sword or a side sword, but think about it about pushing cuts and pulling cuts and scything cuts, these kind of fishing cuts that might come from behind. I think there are all sorts of ways that a sword, a short sword like this, starts to be used in close combat when the close combat is really dictated by the massive shields. And I have always said, when people have said to me, oh Matt, you say that swords weren't primary weapons, what about the Roman legionary? And I always said, okay, to my way of thinking, the primary weapon of a Roman legionary is actually his scutum, his shield. It dictates everything about how the Roman army fought, and how gladiators fought individually as well, and how the Roman soldier fought individually. So whether you're fighting as a single unit or whether you're fighting as a body of men, the scutum is what dictates how you fight. So the scutum is the primary weapon. The gladius is not. And you can fight in a similar way with a scutum and a spear, or a scutum and a dagger, or a scutum and a spatha. It's not the gladius that dictates the fight, it's the shield that dictates the fight. So, there we go. This, incidentally, this is not a review at all, but Albion, as you know, I love Albion swords. Albion makes wonderful weapons, and this is no exception. It is beautiful in the hand. Again, I'm just checking there's no one behind me because I don't want to hit any of my friends with a sharp gladius. Do I? No, I don't want to hit them. Although I'd quite like to hit something with a sharp gladius, I have to say. And this is an incredibly handy and quick weapon. It just wants to cut and dice and slice. It's a lovely, lovely thing. And it's one of the, after the Bronze Age, it's one of the few sword types in the world that actually has a leaf-shaped blade, the Mites Gladius. I think one of the most beautiful swords ever made. And it also has a nice detail. You know how much I love grips that allow you to index the edges, and I love the fact that you've got this kind of hexagonal, debatably octagonal, but hexagonal grip that the fingers just sit into. It instantly gives you edge alignment, and again, that gives you another clue about the use of the sword. Edge alignment was important to them. It's not only a stabbing, thrusting sword, it's also a cutting sword and also a slicing sword as well. I hope that's somewhat of interest to you, and I'm going to try and work out how to get this gladius back into its sheath. There we go, I did it without stabbing myself. It is obviously very strange for me having a sword on the same side as my sword arm. But again, that's another peculiarity of the gladius, and as was mentioned in my recent video of how to wear a sword without a sword belt, here we go. Here's another example of that, the Roman gladius, which is worn simply with a strap which can pass over the head thusly. Anyway, cheers folks, I hope that was somewhat interesting. Bye!
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.